Good evening. I'm Jerry Benjamin, president of the Ahavath Achim Synagogue. On behalf of my fellow AA officers, directors, our trustees, and clergy, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Fran Eizenstat and Eizenstat Family Lecture Series, now in its 32nd year. Our own Stuart Eizenstat, holder of multiple presidential staff and cabinet positions, spanning from the Johnson through the Trump administrations, currently serves as the head of the international practice of the Covington Burling law firm based in Washington, D.C. Stuart has assembled an unparalleled group of past Eizenstat Lecture Series distinguished speakers, including renowned authors and eminent journalists, past U.S. presidents, vice presidents, presidential candidates, prime ministers of the state of Israel, ambassadors, Nobel Prize recipients, secretaries of state, and Supreme Court justices. Of interest, I would direct our listeners to tonight's written program, where you'll find both Stuart's magnificent biography, as well as the fabulous list of past Eizenstat Lecture Series speakers. This year, we're extremely privileged to have as our guest speaker, veteran broadcast journalist, award-winning anchor, and managing editor of PBS NewsHour, Judy Woodruff. Of note, when preparing my remarks for tonight, I learned that Miss Woodruff actually began her journalism career right here in Atlanta as a secretary in the news department of local ABC TV affiliate, WQXI. Together with Ambassador Eizenstat, Ms. Woodruff will be sharing her thoughts on what I know we will all agree to be a most timely topic, the free press in our polarized world. Again, our sincere thanks to Stu Eizenstat and his family for their passionate commitment and support of this incredible lecture series, and to Ms. Woodruff for joining us this evening as our featured guest speaker. Sit back, make yourselves comfortable, as I know everyone will find tonight's discussion to be both insightful and stimulating. Thank you.
Dear friends, my name is Lawrence Rosenthal, one of the rabbis for Ahavath Achim Synagogue in Atlanta, Georgia. I, along with Rabbi Sam Bluffton and Rabbi Neil Sandler, welcome you to this evening's 32nd annual Fran Eizenstat and Eizenstat Family Memorial Lecture. We are grateful to Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat and his family for making this evening possible, along with Miss Woodruff for being this year's speaker. We are in the midst of the Hanukkah holiday, the Jewish festival of lights. We are reminded of all the miracles of this time of year. Although the historical story of Hanukkah is about good winning over evil, the meager conquering the mighty, light shining over the darkness, our sages tell us a different story, a story that got a lot more press than the one about war. The story is about oil, a small amount of oil, enough to last one day, which lasted miraculously for 8 full nights. I could only imagine what the site of the temple must have been for the Maccabees as they went in to rededicate their sacred home. It must have been overwhelming. I believe that our rabbis share the story of the oil for many reasons, but for today, the reason is about perspective. It doesn't take a lot to make a huge difference. Tonight, we are talking about truth and perspectives in an era of deep division, conspiracy theories, and mistrust. The question for us all, as we take a step back and look at our civilization, its schisms and dysfunction, the question is, what could we, as individuals, as communities, as families, what could we do about it? Our Hanukkah holiday reminds us of a truth when we embark on this holy task. We can accomplish a lot with just a little. Thank you for joining us. Happy Hanukkah, Hag Sameach, and happy holidays.
Good evening. I am Miriam Strickman-Levitas, and I am honored to be the chairwoman of this year's Fran Eizenstat and the Eizenstat Family Memorial Lecture. For the first time in history of these 32 years, this lecture is being presented virtually in an unprecedented digital platform. From Atlanta, Georgia, and Washington, D.C., to all of you in Atlanta, across the country, as well as abroad. The following quotes are taken from pages of the Freedom Forum, which is dedicated to the First Amendment, our nation's foundation for free press, free speech, and free spirit. And I quote, "The First Amendment guarantees a free press. The press itself must guarantee a fair one. Freedom of the press is America's first line of defense. Of the many freedoms Americans enjoy, those enumerated in the First Amendment most clearly define our national character." End of quote. Polarization is a historically common feature in American politics. Our country has been struggling with bias and polarization for a very long time. Words matter. The spoken word or the written word. How do we understand and interpret what is being communicated? Do we respond or do we react? I know you believe that you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. I'm going to repeat that. I know you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. Why is our political discourse so divided and troubled? Partisan divides widen over time. How can we narrow that gap? Why is social media so polarizing? How does it polarize us? And how can we possibly fix it? How can we cure the cause? Let's find out. It now gives me great pleasure to present Judy Woodruff in conversation with Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, the free press in our polarized world.
Happy Hanukkah and happy holiday season. Welcome to the 32nd annual Fran Eizenstat and Eizenstat Family Memorial Lecture, which I initially created in 1987 at our family's home synagogue, Ahavath Achim in Atlanta, to honor the memory of my late father, Leo, and then over the years, my late mother, Sylvia, uncle and aunt, Barry and Bessie, and finally, Fran, my beloved wife of 45 years. Fran was a true woman of valor. Her life was infused with tikkun olam, making the world a better place. As a leader of organizations benefiting the general and Jewish communities, locally, nationally, and internationally, and the state of Israel. She continued even when facing serious health challenges. Special thanks to the synagogue's president, Jerry Benjamin, Senior Rabbi Lawrence Rosenthal, Executive Director Barry Herman and his team, Miriam Hadith and Lauren Dubé, and our chairwoman, Miriam Strickland-Levitas, and my assistant, Julia Nicolescu, for making this event possible. We've been privileged over the years to host a remarkable series of guests, Nobel Peace Prize winners, U.S. presidents, U.S. vice presidents, one of whom happily is now president-elect, U.S. Supreme Court justices, secretaries of state, Pulitzer Prize winners, Israeli prime ministers, Israeli ambassadors to the U.S., and many other luminaries. But Fran would have been especially pleased, as am I, with our speaker tonight, Judy Woodruff. In the earliest part of her career with WAGA-TV in Atlanta, she was literally our next door neighbor and friend to our family, including our boys, Jay and Brian. And then later we became very friendly with Judy's talented and wonderful journalist husband, Al Hunt. We're here tonight at a troubling time in our country with bitter partisan divisions, threats to our basic democratic institutions, and challenging to the most fundamental tenet of our democracy, acceptance of the will of the people. Even after multiple recounts and scores of judicial decisions that have confirmed the results. And the press has been in the middle of this maelstrom. Our founding fathers enshrined the freedom of the press in the First Amendment to our Constitution, recognizing that a free, independent press was essential to hold public officials accountable, from the president and Congress to state and local office holders. Benjamin Franklin said, "Republics derive their strength and vigor from a popular examination of the actions of the magistrates." And Thomas Jefferson wrote that freedom will be a short-lived possession unless the people are informed. And yet, from the highest office of our land, there's been an unremitting and unprecedented assault against the press as quote unquote enemies of the people, and the denigration of anything critical in the news as fake news. Tonight, we're going to examine the free press in our polarized world, and no one is better able to help us grapple with this crucial topic than Judy Woodruff. Judy, in my opinion, is our nation's preeminent and most respected broadcast journalist. And from the myriad awards she's received from her peers, this is a widely held view. Judy has had a meteoric rise in her journalistic profession. The daughter of a soldier, she moves so often that she attended 7 schools between kindergarten and 7th grade and lived on U.S. bases as far-flung as Taiwan and Germany. After graduating from Duke, she moved to Atlanta, where she covered the Georgia legislature and the 1976 Jimmy Carter presidential campaign. When he was elected, Judy moved to Washington to become NBC TV's correspondent covering the Carter White House. And our family followed her tracks as I became the president's chief White House domestic policy advisor. Judy continued as NBC's White House correspondent into the first 2 years of the Reagan presidency. She moved from NBC to an initial stint at PBS as chief White House correspondent for the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour and anchor of the award-winning documentary series Frontline with Judy Woodruff. She then joined CNN anchoring 2 very popular programs, Inside Politics and CNN Worldwide. She then returned to PBS and earned the role in which millions now see her every weekday night as the anchor of PBS NewsHour, providing balanced, objective, and incisive news coverage of the U.S. and the world on everything from politics and healthcare to war zones and arts and culture. Judy, you honor us with your presence. On PBS NewsHour, you're the one interviewing others. Tonight, I have the privilege of interviewing you and drawing on questions which many in our large audience have already sent us. So let's get started by talking about your background. And let me just group these and let you answer your early years. What influence on your career did being the child of a soldier where you lived all over the US and the world have on becoming a journalist? And did you always want to become one? And you've done it all in broadcast journalism. Perhaps you could tell us about your early mentors who helped you climb up the ladder of success.
Well, first of all, Stu, I'm going to do what the politicians do, which is thank you from the bottom of my heart for inviting me to be this year's lecturer. I am incredibly honored. I knew, of course, your incredibly loved wife, Fran, and am so thrilled to be part of honoring her legacy as I join you this evening. And yes, my next door neighbor in Atlanta were Stu and Fran Eizenstat, and their adorable little boys. And so I would love to tell you, Stu, that that's what set me on the course to where I am today. It was only a good influence when we lived next door to each other on Haven Ridge Drive. But in terms of those early years, Stu, we did move all over the world. We did move 7 times between kindergarten and 7th grade. And I know that gave me an interest in the world. My mother's family had been in Oklahoma, my father's family in North Carolina. Both of their families had pretty much stayed where they were. But we were traveling, and I was doing something none of my cousins were doing. They were all staying put, either in Roanoke Rapids or Tulsa, while I was moving around the world. And I know that gave me a great interest in the world. It didn't introduce me to journalism, though. That really came later. When I graduated from high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted a career. My mother had never finished 10th grade. And she said to me, "You are going to get an education. Education matters more than anything." So that was drummed into my head. She kept saying, "Diapers and dishes can wait." But I didn't know what form that could take, because looking around, Stu, there weren't very many women who had careers. Most of the mothers of my friends were stay-at-home moms, as my mother was. So I looked around, I wasn't sure. I majored in math when I first went off to college because I loved math, and I thought I'd make a career, somebody said, as an insurance actuary. But I happened to have a fabulous political science professor my freshman year at Meredith College before I transferred to Duke, and I just fell in love with politics and decided that was going to be the field for me. And then after working in Washington a couple of summers, the women who worked on Capitol Hill told me that I shouldn't come back to Washington. This was 1967, 68, because they said, "You'll be treated like the gopher, you'll get coffee, and that'll be the end of it." So I went back to Duke my senior year, and I asked my favorite professor, "What am I going to do?" You know, they tell me I shouldn't go to Washington. And literally in a couple of conversations, he said to me, "Well, did you ever think about covering politics?" So it was about that abrupt a turn. I started looking into journalism, and the rest is history. I went to Atlanta, interviewed with 3 news directors, and it was only the news director at one station who needed a secretary. So he hired me as the newsroom secretary. I even did the weather. It was a Cinderella story, Stu. I have to tell this. I was the secretary during the week, answering the phone and cleaning the film, because that's what we used. And then on the weekends, I would come in on Sunday nights at 6 o'clock with an appropriate dress on, whereas during the week I was dressed like a college kid. And I would memorize the weather news wires and did the weather for 3 or 4 minutes at 11 o'clock on Sunday night. But after 6 months, we agreed that was not my calling. And I went on to just be a pest and insist that I be hired as a reporter. The news director's answer was, "We already have a woman reporter." So I very quickly found out that the women thing was an issue, no matter whether you were going to work in math or politics or journalism. But in terms of mentors, they were mostly men. It was Ray Moore. Some of the people listening, you, Stu, probably remember Ray. He was a really revered newsman in Atlanta for many, many years. He became a close friend and advisor to me, and later at NBC, John Chancellor, and meant a lot. And then finally, Jim Lehrer and Robin McNeil, who took me under their wing, brought me, offered me that incredible opportunity to go to the NewsHour when people told me I was crazy to leave NBC. Why would you leave a mothership network, commercial network, to go to work for public television? But it turned out to be the best professional decision I ever made.
So Judy, you and I both had a break at about the same time, and that is, you had been covering Jimmy Carter and his campaign. He won. We both ended up going to Washington. I was in the White House. You were covering the White House. So you've now, over the years, not only covered both President Carter and President Reagan in the White House, but you've observed all the presidents since, including President Trump. Tell us what it's like to report from the sort of epicenter of power, and how, if at all, the coverage of the Trump White House is different than any of the other presidents you may have done or observed?
Well, it's sobering, first and foremost, to have the responsibility to tell the world, because that really is what you're doing. You're reporting to the American people, but of course, American news media are picked up around the world. You're reporting to the world on what the most powerful person in the world is doing every day. And so when I arrived in Washington in January 1977 to cover Jimmy Carter's inauguration, I was scared out of my mind. I had covered the Georgia legislature. I had covered the Carter administration as governor, but it's nothing like the pressure and the hot light, if you will, that's on you as a journalist. I was working for NBC, so I had the great support of a big commercial network, and I had colleagues who were terrific. But essentially, you're on your own. You're there to report. You're competing with other news organizations every minute of the day, and it's even more so today than it was then. And then it was intense. I was competing against both television and print, and you are on the line. Your work is on the line. You're being judged all the time. I thrived in that environment. I loved the competition. I loved the daily, the energy of it. I love the fact that it mattered. So, but your question is, how has it changed over time? I mean, Stu, we've gone from 3 networks to over time to, multiple channels of news, cable news, online news, social media, so that today's reporters covering the White House have so much more to think about and to worry about as they do their job. But to your bottom line question about President Trump, it's completely different from every other president I've covered. I've covered Democrats, I've covered Republicans, Ronald Reagan, the conservative, Bill Clinton, Democrat, Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, and certainly both Presidents Bush. This is a president who, as everybody knows, came from a very different background, from business, from a reality TV show, didn't have the grounding in public life, if you will, hadn't worked in public service. And it's been a challenge. I mean, you said it a moment ago, Stu, this president from the beginning called us enemies of the American people, has said all the news that basically he doesn't like is fake. And I think the first time I had to correct on the air something the president of the United States said because it was false, I literally got a catch in my throat, because it's not as if other presidents haven't exaggerated or they haven't tried to make themselves look good. And we know clearly, things are said that aren't exactly true or exactly, but to have an industry practically coming out of an administration of information that just can't be borne out with facts, by facts, is a whole new category of journalism. And it's a new category of leadership, and it's a new category for us as journalists to understand how to report it.
Thank you. So now let's talk about the transformation of journalism over your career, from network to cable, public broadcasting. In 1980, through the genius, really, of Atlanta's Ted Turner, he created a revolution in news broadcasting with CNN cable news, that is 24/7 news coverage, which did not exist before. You had a leading role in several CNN programs. How did this intensity of 24/7 news coverage change journalism and change public officials?
I give Ted Turner enormous credit. I mean, I was one of those in the very beginning when he founded CNN, and I was one of the many who made fun of what they were doing. They were hiring people who didn't have much experience. They were working on a budget. They didn't put what we call production values into their programming, where you have the fancy lights and studio sets and so forth. But what they were doing is they were covering the news, and they were doing it, as you say, 24/7. And it was not just in this country, it was around the world. And he was committed to covering the entire world and not sleeping. I mean, doing it constantly. And as you know very well, it was only after the first Iraq War when people began, I think, to take CNN more seriously. But we should have taken them more seriously to begin with because of Ted Turner's really brilliant idea. I think it clearly helped to transform journalism in this country. Today, everything we do is 24/7. Online has magnified that. Social media has now made it, 24/7 by 24/7. And so it's improved it. It's made us realize that we can cover much more. We can spend more time on stories, but it's also had, I think, in some ways, it's allowed some of us, I think, in journalism, and I saw this when I was at CNN, to gravitate to stories that we know people will want to watch because there is the commercial imperative. You want the eyeballs. And so you keep going back to the stories that people want to see. And so they're constantly balancing that out. But no, Ted Turner performed a great service for all of us. And then along came Rupert Murdoch with Fox and MSNBC and Katie Bar the Door. And today you have those three plus many other channels that are now out there competing for our attention.
So I want to get into this, but I do want to say, if I may, just from being a public official, that 24/7 intense coverage also pushed public officials to act more quickly, sometimes without the opportunity to do the kind of studied review of an issue, because you were constantly being asked, how about this? And you just had to react much more quickly. And I think it put the same kind of pressure on journalists.
It did. It does. It puts the same pressure on us. And frankly, more mistakes are made. When you have less time to vet a story, to talk to sources, to understand the story, to put it in context, sometimes to go back and read some information that you need to know in order to make a story clear, and frankly, to make sure you're not misleading people in some way. That a lot of that time is gone now. It's instant. You have to be on your toes. I will say, Stu, that I think what we've tried to do in the press, and I think the cables try to do this, sometimes we don't do it well enough, is remind people that we are covering a story as it's breaking, that we only know this much at this hour, and we're going to be learning more, and we will continue to tell you what we know. Having said that, there's still pressure. There's pressure to get it out there even before information has been checked, and that can lead to mistakes, and it has led to mistakes.
So let me group a whole series of questions, and I think if there's one theme of so many of the questions, it's really the one I'm about to try to summarize. When we were growing up, there essentially were three network news anchors, half an hour in the evening, ABC, CBS, NBC, without heavy opinions, and we essentially took what they said as fact, a sort of common body of fact, a little tilt perhaps one way or the other, but basically a series of facts. Now it says, people are saying we can't receive a common set of facts. There are alternative worlds, Fox on one hand, on the right, MSNBC on the left, now even newer outlets, Newsmax, Breitbart, One America News, which say and identify themselves as right-wing pro-Trump networks. They say that expressly. They've almost become captive news stations for the world as the president sees it. So Judy, how have broadcast journalists who had grown up perhaps in an era of just reporting facts straight on without opinion had to adapt and adopt to this world of opinion where it's hard to separate opinion from fact? How are American people able to discern the truth about what's being reported? How can we deal with unfounded conspiracy theories? Is there a way of getting back to where we were before with a common set of facts? And I would say again, as a former public official, you do have to, in order to govern, to make policy, to pass laws, to make decisions, there has to be some sort of agreed set of policies. You may have a different outcome if you're a Republican or Democrat, but at least you have a common body. So deal with this incredible revolution as we went again from a group of networks giving what we accepted as fact to a multiplicity of cables with different worlds and different opinions.
You know, I've been reminded, Stu, that what we have today is almost going back to the early days of the Republic, when we had a very opinionated press. You know, the yellow journalism, that was the pejorative term for a lot of it. We had there was a time in this country when all press was opinion, or most of it. We developed over time, and certainly well into the 20th century, when the press was trying, and that's when I started out as a reporter. I was told nobody cared what I thought, and I was not to report on what I thought. My job as a reporter was to go out and gather the information, bring it back, and write it and put it in a form that's understandable to the audience, and leave my opinion out of it. That's what I learned. That's what I cut my teeth on. It's still the journalism that I believe in. It's the foundation of what the NewsHour does. Having said that, what you just described is exactly right. What we have today, we are swimming in a sea of opinion. There are journalists on the networks. I think on the network evening news, morning news, if you will. I think there's still an attempt to play it straight. But once you get to cable, certainly once you get to online, to social media, you have hundreds and if not thousands of journalists who have, either because they've chosen it or because it was the only option for them, what they're doing is essentially expressing an opinion or pushing a set of facts. And it's as if we exist now in an advocacy journalism driven time. You asked if I'm comfortable with it. No, I feel like a dinosaur many days, because I still like to ask the basic questions. You know, why is this happening? And what do you think? And what do you think? And let's put it together and see where we are. And then I believe in letting our viewers and our followers online make up their minds about what they want to do. I mean, who they believe and who they want to vote for. But we are in a very polarized moment, as all of you know who are watching, and you certainly know this, Stu. And I think as long as that is the case, there is a disagreement over a set of facts. There's a disagreement right now, a profound disagreement over what happened in this election. I think, based on my reporting and talking to people whose information I trust, this election was not riddled with fraud. Yes, there were a couple of mistakes here and there, but the vote was counted correctly, and we know who the president-elect is. We know what the outcome is. But there is a whole push coming from one side of the political spectrum to say that it was fraudulent. And we're seeing some cracks in that front right now. Some Republicans are starting to say they see Joe Biden as the president-elect. But it's more than just this election. It's issue after issue, from immigration to the economy, to education, to how do you handle healthcare, which has been an extremely polarizing issue. Lesser degree foreign policy, although even foreign policy has been caught up in this polarized time to the extent it affects America's interests. And so I wish I could sit here tonight and tell you that I think we're going to get through this, that we're going to go back to the, quote, good old days when we all had an agreed upon set of facts. But I don't see that on the horizon right now. I still see truly visceral partisanship, polarization in this country. I see families divided over it, cousins, siblings, parents, children hardly talking to each other because they have different views. I don't think it's good for our democracy. It's not, on the one hand, it's healthy to have a debate in our democracy. It's what our country was founded on, having open the First Amendment, being able to express your opinion and argue about it and make a decision based on that. But we're now in a time where your adversary is seen as the enemy, is seen as Satan in some arguments, is seen as somebody who is not a patriotic American. I think it's gone way too far, and I hope we can come back from the brink before it's too late.
Well, thank you. And, the question, I guess, is, has broadcast journalism in particular simply reflected this division, or is it actually accelerating the polarization as we have these competing networks? And where do you think that this polarization has arisen from? Is it income inequality? Is it the rapid change of technology? Is it the changing face of America as we go more and more to a majority country? What do you think is the reason for this tremendous polarization, which again the press either reports on or indeed perhaps enhances?
Well, those are all excellent questions, and far more smarter people than I am can answer them, but I'll take a stab at them. And I think in terms of, you asked about broadcast journalists, I would widen that out to include cable. Are we reflecting it, or are we stirring the pot? I think we're doing both. And I don't mean just the NewsHour. I think we really, truly strive at the NewsHour to cover all sides of the story. That's our bread and butter. That's who we are. We try hard to represent, both sides, all sides. But I think in general, what you've seen in television journalism is a gravitation to conflict. And if there's a debate, if there's a fight, if there's a dispute, if people are calling names or throwing rocks, that's where we go. Some of that is the news imperative. You go to where there's conflict. You go to where things are not working out. We don't report it on a day when there are no car accidents. If you're the local news station, that's not the definition of news. The definition of news is when things go wrong. But I think we've taken it to a different level. When you see program after program on some television channels only about argument and only about name calling, or what we see more of now, just completely adopting one point of view or another. The much harder question, Stu, for me is, why have we ended up here? I see a number of factors. Going back to, I can think of administration after administration. During the Carter administration, Democrats and Republicans disagreed with each other. They fought over issues. Democrats disagreed with other Democrats. But the point came from me probably in the 90s. I remember after Bill Clinton was elected that I was, of course, talking to people on both sides of the political. I remember hearing more and more Republicans saying to me they didn't consider Bill Clinton a legitimate president. That who did he think he was, the governor of a small state, defeating this very distinguished former ambassador, CIA director, President George H.W. Bush. He didn't deserve to be president. I remember the Newt Gingrich, speaking of a native Georgian, and his contract for America. And it was in effect, a repudiation of Clinton's agenda. You started to hear more and more that kind of language of animus, I call it, where the other side is not just somebody I disagree with, but they're really bad people. And you started hearing that in the 90s. And then, of course, in 2000, with the election of George W. Bush, the 37 days waiting for the Supreme Court, then you heard Democrats saying that they thought George W. Bush was not the legitimate president, that Al Gore really had more votes. And then it just accelerated after that. There was a brief sort of calming down after 9/11 when the country came together, but then we were back at it again. And often running the Obama campaign, Obama election, where you had people saying that he was not born in the United States, that he was an illegitimate president, all the disagreement. I could go on, and that's what we have today. We have this assumption that the other side is not just wrong, but their motives are venal, and they're here for the wrong reasons, and we need to do something about it. And that's grown up, and I think the press has played that up. Some of it, we can't help it because it's happening. On the other hand, I think news organizations have made money off of it, frankly. I think there have been ratings go up when people are throwing eggs at each other or tomatoes or worse. And that's to be regretted. Do I know how we could have dialed that back? I think decisions could have been made to dial it back, but it's a commercial world that we live in. And you named some other factors at work, Stu. I think it's more than just the few things I've mentioned. It's technology. It's the fact that it's now everybody has a say on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube. Everybody can speak up and they can declare that this is the final gospel truth. And then they line up on one side and the other side. And just to button it up, what we have now is people shoving each other. And in Washington, D.C., this weekend, people were stabbed in the street. You had the groups come out supporting President Trump, and then other groups disagreed, and they got into a fight, and people are getting hurt. And I worry a lot about all the threats that have been directed at election officials around the country. So it's a worrying time, and I keep saying I hope the younger generation can find a better way through this than my generation.
Thank you. And you mentioned this briefly, but I think it's important. PBS has a particular niche. It's not commercial, doesn't depend to the same degree on advertising dollars. It gives you, I take it, somewhat greater freedom to explore issues in more detail and more balance. And yet, I suppose you still have to worry about ratings too. So how does PBS fit into this? How do you compete with this vigorous press on the left and on the right that is whipping up advertising dollars and getting a boost in their ratings by being so opinionated and so polarizing? How does PBS deal with this? And it's an important niche.
I give so much of the credit, frankly, Stu, to Robin McNeil and Jim Lehrer, who co-anchored the Watergate hearings back in the early 70s and then started what became the McNeil-Lehrer Report in 1975. It went on to expand it to an hour in 1983. I think the NewsHour, and I'm giving them credit, has become a place that shows that journalism can be not only reasonable, it can be strong, it can go to the most important stories and remind everybody why they matter, and it can bring in all points of view. And that's still our mission today. You're absolutely right. We don't have to worry about the commercial imperative. We don't have to worry about exact numbers of eyeballs. At the same time, we want people to watch. We don't want people turning us off in droves. And I'm happy to say that our audience numbers have very much held up. We're so gratified by that. But I think, it's the mission of PBS to be the medium that serves the people, the public, rather than other interests. And I don't want to knock all my friends who work in commercial television and news organizations. They do phenomenal work, and a lot of close friends work for the networks and for other organizations. So I'm not criticizing them, but I'm just saying for us, it does give us, you're absolutely right, because we don't have to worry about the minute by minute. We can go to those stories as we do tonight. I mean, tonight on the program, we did a long interview with the chief medical officer for one of the largest nursing home companies in the country. They're in, I think, 28 states, talking to them about the challenge of getting everyone vaccinated. That was like an 8-minute interview that my colleague Amna Nawaz conducted. I did an interview with a voter, someone who's active in getting out the vote, nonpartisan in Atlanta ahead of the Georgia Senate runoffs. We did a long report on tonight, almost 10 minutes, on childhood trauma. It's part of a series we're doing this week on the underreported story of children who grow up in rural areas, and not just urban America, that gets a lot of attention, but in rural areas and even on Native American reservations, with trauma passed on from generation to generation. I'm just giving you a couple of examples to say, these are the kinds of stories that we think matter. We pay attention to science, we pay attention to education and to issues. And Robin McNeil used to say, we dare to be boring, and we teased him about it. And we hope we're not boring, because we think the things that matter aren't boring. That's what people are interested in, and that's what our followers and our viewers tell us. But we know we have a place in the American media spectrum, if you will. There's plenty of noise on the right and plenty of noise on the left, and we strive to be the place in the center that listens to everyone.
Thank you, Judy. I've worked with a number of presidents, and I know that no president likes criticism for the press and holding them accountable. And even going back to George Washington, who complained about what he called the infamous scribblers who were covering his administration. But it does seem, as we discussed at the beginning, that President Trump's attitude has been qualitatively different. As you mentioned, calling critics enemies of the people, which is something we associate with authoritarian regimes, like fake news and the like. What impact has that had on you as a journalist, on your colleagues? Has it cowed them? Has it made them, in effect, afraid to take him on, or had the opposite impact?
I think in the beginning, Stu, people didn't quite know what to make of it, whether this was a tactic or whether it was something the president wanted to do. My friend Leslie Stahl, who covered the White House with me, you know her well, with CBS, of course, now with 60 Minutes. I talked to Leslie a couple of years ago. She's now shared this publicly, so it's not a secret. She said that after she did an interview with President Trump when he first took office, and she said to him, I think when he was first elected, 60 Minutes did an interview. She asked him why, she said, this was off camera, why are you so hard on the press? Why do you call them fake news and enemy? And he said, because when they report things that I don't like, I don't want the public to believe them. And when she shared this, I mean, she recognized that was a telling statement. I think that's a telling statement. And when I hear that, it makes me think, no, this is not just a tactic. It's part of a philosophy of this country. The free press is not. It's not a respected part of our democracy. I mean, the founding fathers, why did they put a free press, freedom of the press, in the First Amendment? Because they believed that we needed this ability to criticize. And you're absolutely right. No politician loves it. Nobody likes to be criticized. I don't like nobody does. I mean, it's perfectly human reaction. At the same time, if you're working as a servant of the public, if you're elected or appointed to public office, you should be held accountable by the press. You shouldn't be presumed to be trying to do things that you're not trying to do, though. I mean, I do think that there are some moments if you look back at the press history, when cynicism has taken over skepticism. I think it's fine to be skeptical, but when you become cynical and you believe that everybody who's elected to office is, there to do something bad, I think we've clearly gone too far. So I think we need to be careful about how we define the role of the press. But to come back to President Trump, what we've seen is somebody who doesn't even see a healthy role for the news media. And I do worry that attitude, I mean, I know it's already filtered down to many Americans. The percentage of Americans who now tell pollsters that they don't trust the press, they think the press has an agenda, has gone up steadily right now. If I'm not mistaken, it's more than half. And we're not, I don't do this to win a popularity contest, but at the same time, I think it's important that the press be respected for the role that it plays. And that's, to see that fractured, that's hard to see, hard to watch.
Reporters Without Borders is an organization that publishes an annual World Freedom Index, and their most recent one had the U.S. only 45th among nations in terms of press freedom, in part because of the hostility toward the media. So this is something, it seems to me, that, Judy, is not just a journalistic issue, it goes to the heart of our democracy. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I will share with you a report that my colleague Yamiche Alcindor did just tonight on the NewsHour. She spoke with about 8 or 10 immigrants from other countries who came from countries from Belarus, from Sudan, other parts of the world. They came from countries with repressive governments. And she spoke with them, Yamiche spoke with them about how they hear what President Trump is saying when he calls all of his critics enemies, when he says that they are out to undermine our country, and when he says they should be, even he's spoken about thrown in jail or done away with, so to speak, that there are echoes, they're hearing echoes of what they heard back in Belarus, back in Sudan, and I could name other countries where the press is not free, where you have authoritarian leaders. So you're right. It's not just what's happened to our democracy. It's the signal this sends to leaders around the world that it's a perfectly okay thing to not talk to the press, dismiss the press, accuse them of being anti-American, of being anti-Constitution. And again, I don't want to say, I think I said this a moment ago, we're not perfect. We make mistakes. And when we make them, we need to acknowledge that right away. And by the way, I don't believe there's such a thing as objectivity, Stu. I mean, I think all we can do is strive to be fair. And that's my philosophy of journalism. But when it comes to the message being sent to other world leaders, it's worrying.
So in your career, what's been your biggest challenge, Judy? If you think back over the decades, is there one thing that comes to mind, one particular incident, or is it simply a spectrum of events?
Excuse me, I'm hoping my husband in another room gets the phone. If he doesn't, I'm going to pick it up and hang it. Pick it up and hang up. Sorry about that. Pick it up and hang up. Sorry. I would say, there was a point in my career, Stu, when I would have said being a woman, as I mentioned at the beginning, because I left out the part about the math, the math instructor in college who said women shouldn't be taking advanced math, shouldn't be taking calculus. And then there was the message I got on Capitol Hill, women shouldn't be in politics. And then, of course, in journalism, the colleagues who said, why do we need another dumb blonde in the newsroom? And one of my colleagues at the station where I was hired to report on Georgia politics said that. So, that's just there. But as I look back on it, I think we've come so far that I don't want to dwell on that. It's clear that it took women a long time to get to the place where we need to be, but I think we've come a very long way. It's not perfect, but you certainly today see more women covering every beat. You see women in management making editorial decisions, not enough. I think that's still the area where we need to make much more progress. We need more women who are editors of our major news organizations, who are leading those organizations and making decisions about what we cover and what we write about. We need more women on the opinion pages of our newspapers and our online sources of information. So if you're asking me what is a kind of overall challenge, I might say women, but as I think about it, I can't, how can I complain in a way? I mean, I've been able to have, as I look back on a remarkable career, I've had support along the way from the individuals I mentioned, Jack Chancellor, Jim and Robin here at the NewsHour, and today, incredible support. I would say that for me, being in Washington, learning the ways of Washington, that probably for me was the hardest thing, learning how things tick, what makes people tick in Washington. And I would never say that I've got it figured out after 40 plus years in Washington. But I would say that over time, I've come to understand it better. But by and large, Stu, I feel pretty lucky. I feel very blessed, as I look back on my career, much more so than I would complain about anything.
Well, I would say talent more than luck. Presidential debates. You've moderated numerous presidential debates. What special burdens does this place on you and others in that seat as moderators? And when we examine the two Trump-Biden presidential debates in 2020, what could we do to improve them, to make the participants more responsive in terms of answering and providing substantive responses, perhaps instant fact checks? But from that seat, what particular burdens do you have? That's got to be a lot of pressure too. I mean, you have elections hinging on those debates, and here you are in the middle trying to be the moderator. So reflect a bit about being the moderator in the debates, and then as we go into look at the 2020 debates, which were hardly models, what you think about that and how we can improve them.
Well, I would say, just as a reminder of how debates are not always telling in terms of how an election is going to turn out, I was the moderator of the vice presidential debate in 1988 when Lloyd Bentsen was going up against George H.W. Bush's vice presidential pick, and that was the Indiana Senate.
Dan Quayle.
So Dan Quayle, who had only served in the Senate a short time, was younger than Lloyd Bentsen, who was seen as a very patrician senior figure in the United States Senate. And Quayle, out on the campaign trail, had been from time to time comparing himself to John Kennedy, who was young and yet who meteoric rise. And when he brought it up during the debate in answer to one of the questions, and there were a panel of questioners with me, Bentsen shot back, and we all remember this: Senator, I knew Jack Kennedy. Senator, you are no Jack Kennedy. Well, the room exploded, and a lot of us thought, and it was the headlines the next day, and a lot of people thought, well, there goes the Bush-Quayle ticket with that put down. Well, of course, it didn't matter. I mean, it was a vice presidential debate, first of all. But second of all, these debates are a moment in time. They tell us something about the person, but they're not the end all and be all. I will tell you, I have a lot of problem, Stu, with the format of many of these debates, because today we've gravitated toward this 30-second, 90-second, 60-second. And I realize the point is to put the candidates under some pressure, to force them to condense whatever it is they know about an issue or a thought or a subject into an elevator pitch, get it down to 30 seconds or 60 seconds, make your point. But what it's become is the candidates have so mastered this, if they're really good at it, and they turn around and use it against the moderator. And of course, I think the first Trump Biden debate this year was a completely different animal. I've never seen anything like that one, where President Trump completely dominated, not just dominated his opponent and Vice President Biden, but he also dominated the moderator in that he just took over the stage. And I think a lot of people watched that debate and they said, well, it's all over. Well, President Trump's supporters loved it. I mean, he played right into the hands of people who like who he is and what he does. So I think debates are over. In a way, they're overplayed. We expect a lot from them, more than they can deliver. On the other hand, we do need to see these candidates together somehow responding to important questions. And so, I would, if you ask me what I'd like to see, I'd like to see more of a conversational format where the two of them, okay, let's talk for the next 15 minutes about the economy, or let's talk about poverty, or let's talk about race in America, or let's talk about China, and hear the conversation and what do they say. But I realize, there's a need to put time limits on. But you're right, Stu, a lot of pressure on the moderator. You can believe, as Chris Wallace, and I'm trying to remember who the other moderators were. Kristen Welker of NBC had the second presidential debate. It turned out to be the second. It had been the third. The middle one was canceled. A lot of pressure under them. I wish all my colleagues well when they are given that assignment.
So let's look at the future of journalism now in the last segment. We've alluded to this, but let's focus now not just on cable, not just on the multiplicity of channels, not just on the divisions between MSNBC and Fox and Breitbart and so forth, but let's look at new social media. There was, Judy, a very recent Pew survey that I found that showed 55% of American adults either often or sometimes get their news from social media, and that most Americans are not reading their daily papers or watching the evening news, right or left, but they're turning to Facebook, to Twitter, and to other social media for their news. The problem is that they don't operate under any journalistic rules in terms of vetting, corroboration of stories. And some experts have expressed concern that social media is allowing an agenda to be promoted on their platforms rather than having some sort of factual reporting. And that what's been passed off as news on social media is really misinformation, right-wing propaganda. And as you mentioned earlier, any Tom, Dick, and Harry can publish something and it can go viral. This seems to me a qualitatively different challenge to journalism and to democracy. So talk about the role of social media and how the journalistic profession deals with this phenomenon where people aren't going to any cable stations, right or left, but they're getting their news, again, through Twitter and Facebook and whatever someone decides to put on as his or her opinion.
Well, it's the best of times and it's the worst of times, because on the one hand, it's wonderful that people have at their fingertips access. You can look at your Twitter feed, you can look at your Facebook page, see what people are sharing with you. It's wonderful to be in touch with family, with friends, to see what people send you. It's great to be able to check out your favorite news website, whether it's the far left or the far right or something in the middle. And the fact that, as you and I have both now said, that any one of us can contribute to this. If we see something happening, we can report on it, we can tweet about it, and it can get picked up and you can become well known for your 15 minutes of fame. And so there's the good, but there's also the very worrying part of it, which is a lot of rumor, completely unvetted, no second, checking out of sources. It's just out there. And I think part for me, Stu, the bigger concern is not even that the sources aren't checked and it's not vetted. It's that some people now only want to hear the news and information that reinforces what they already think. They're just not interested in hearing anything else, in learning anything new. They've closed their minds. And I'm not saying people aren't entitled to their opinion. Absolutely they are. That's what our democracy is all about. I respect that. But I'm one of those people who thinks you keep learning throughout your life. You keep seeing things, you keep understanding things, you keep meeting people, you just keep growing and you keep learning. Your mind keeps expanding. And what we're seeing today, though, is almost a closing of minds. People say, I've seen all I need to see, I've made up my mind, and this is it. I don't want to hear anything else. I'm only going to go to this source, whether it's on the left or the right or the far left or the far right. And once again, I keep saying, you have a right to have your own opinion. But when more and more Americans do that, and we don't have a middle ground and we don't have an agreed upon set of facts, I do worry about the strength of our democracy. Our democracy depends on the free flow of information. And if we don't have a free flow of information, if we just have people in their different camps believing different things, it's a different model. And I don't know where we go from here. We talked about a little bit about this a moment ago. I think it puts a greater burden today on all of us to check out our sources. I mean, the people who are still looking for new information, people send you something or you spot it on your computer and you say, well, is that right? Does that sound right? I say, just check it out. Look at the source. Did it come from the AP, or did it come from, NBC or the NewsHour? Where did Wall Street Journal? I mean, where did you hear it? So we've all got our work cut out for us for a long time.
Twitter and Facebook, at least now, are putting checks next to certain statements, suggesting that people go deeper. At least that's the beginning
Right.
of the idea, as people to do it. And I wonder, Judy, really whether we ought to incorporate this into our early education system in terms of civics, where we teach kids to look for a variety of information, to understand the role of the press, and whether this really ought to be built into civics programs in schools at the earliest age.
I think that that's something that is being done now. I mean, there are more and more. You may know that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor has really dedicated herself after she left the Supreme Court to promoting civic education. I know a number of people who work very hard in that space to get more schools to teach civics and to teach, how do you become media literate? What's the best way to absorb information out there when you just live in this blizzard of facts and allegations that are flying around you at 90 miles an hour all day long? I think it ought to be required teaching. There ought to be a course or courses throughout. I mean, and teaching children from the time they're very young to look at information and say, where did that come from? Teach critical thinking. I think all that it's in keeping with our democratic system. It's in keeping with this amazing system of education we have in this country. For all the criticism of it, it's still done an extraordinary job. I went to public schools. I know a lot of people who did and who do send their children today to public schools. But we are asking a lot of the education system because we are sending kids today out into a world where technology has gotten ahead of our ability in many cases to keep up with what's being thrown at us. How can we, with AI and the information that's being sort of spun out there, it's so far ahead of what many human minds can wrap themselves around. We all have to, we have to find a way to deal with it. And education is clearly going to be part of the picture.
So, at the other end of the spectrum, since 2005, 1 in every 5 local newspapers is closed. And this is leaving some 2,000 communities without one newspaper. It's a loss of a shared sense of facts at a local level, holding local officials accountable. And your own Jeffrey Brown on PBS NewsHour in January of this year interviewed journalists who felt that this crisis in journalism at the local level was also a crisis in democracy, that local corruption vote goes up, voter participation goes down when you don't have local newspapers reporting on local events. Do you agree with this? And is there a way, with all the other challenges, to revitalize independent local print and media?
Well, the bad news is you're absolutely right. It's what you said. So many local papers, just a really shocking number of local papers around the country, local news organizations have gone under. There are, I believe, something like 15, 20,000 journalists who've been laid off just in the last few years. Some of them have been able to find jobs in online journalism, but it's been very hard for others and they haven't. I worry more about the demise or the challenges of local journalism than anything else. And why? Because it's just what you said, it's at the community level. These are the reporters who are covering the school board meeting, who are looking at how the police force is responding to violence or other challenges in the community. They're looking at public officials and whether they're fulfilling their job, the job that they're being paid to do for people. They're the glue that holds the community together. And yet so many of them have now disappeared. I will tell you, I spoke at a conference of county commissioners in Pennsylvania. This must have been 15 years ago. And even then, I had a group of them come up to me after my remarks and say, we so wish we still had reporters covering the county commission meetings. They don't cover it anymore because they can't afford to. And they very candidly said, we need that oversight we need to know that the public is hearing about what we do because it holds us accountable. It's kind of probably, I don't know, for people who don't have to spend all day thinking about journalism, it can almost be kind of, why does that matter? But it is the fabric of our democracy. These are the little pieces, the threads that hold us together as a community, and then as a county, as a state, as a country. And if we're weak at the local level, then we're ultimately going to be weak nationally. What do we do about it? The good news too, though I can give you a little bit of good news, is that some foundations and even some business people have put some money. Warren Buffett has put some money into trying to shore up newspapers. We've seen a number of foundations putting money into efforts to, for example, the Texas Tribune is an online publication in the state of Texas where they've been able to pick up some of the pieces for the local news organizations that have gone under. And again, it's happened in community after community after community. This is happening around the country. It's not happening fast enough. The resources aren't sufficient, but we are starting to talk about it, and it's getting more publicity. And so I think it's great that you're talking about it, and that it's a concern to you and and the community who you're talking to.
So Judy, we sent invitations out tonight to all the major schools of journalism around the country. Should, in light of this really transformation of news, multiplicity of cable stations, the opinion rather than fact, the old story, you're entitled to your opinions but not your facts, but now we can't even rely on the facts, and social media, should schools of journalism be recalibrating their whole curriculum to deal with these transformations and to promote high standards of objective reporting? Do they have a role, and do you have a sense of whether they're coming up to dealing with these transformations?
Well, my first caveat is that I did not study journalism. I certainly wish that I had at least been able to study it at the graduate level, but I did major in political science. It was my interest until I finished school. I think the schools of journalism, their main responsibility is to teach the basics. Make sure that these young people who are considering a career in journalism learn the basics, that they get a great liberal arts education, that they study economics and history and English, and get a great cross section of background before they really plunge into the details of journalism. And that once they do, it's the basics. Because I think without the basics, we're not equipped. We don't have the equipment to deal with this complex technological change that is moving faster than any of us can possibly foresee. Do I think that, yes, we need to figure out ways to take basics and make it watchable and make it shareable, and all the things that happen on YouTube and Instagram and I'm trying to think of Snapchat and the other platforms that are out there for sharing news. Most of them a lot shorter, like Twitter. What is it, 200 and some characters in a Twitter feed, a Twitter message. It's all short, but I think first you learn the basics. You learn how to report. You learn sticking to the facts. You learn what sources to go to. All those basics, I think, are absolutely essential. Then you teach, how do you do this for Twitter or for Facebook or for the New York Times online or for the NewsHour. I mean, the NewsHour now, you see the television program, but there's an entire side of the NewsHour that is all about online, many, many stories that we can't get on television every night. So much of it, it's human stories. It's stories about education. It's stories about music, the arts, foreign policy. It runs the gamut. And no matter what platform reporters are working on, whether it's the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or NBC News or the PBS NewsHour, or they're working for Breitbart or somebody else, I want to believe that they know the basics of journalism before they learn all the bells and whistles.
So with all of the challenges and abuse that reporters are getting, would you advise a young person to go into a career in journalism? And is there a pipeline of strong candidates? And if so, what would you advise that young student in journalism to do, how to get started? What does he or she have to learn? But again, even at the beginning, you were advised to go into math. Would you advise people now to go into journalism?
Absolutely. We need all the smart, curious, dedicated, relentlessly hardworking young people that we can possibly get. Our democracy will not survive unless we have journalists, young journalists coming into the profession who, into the craft, whether you call it one or the other, who are curious, who want to understand what's going on in the world, in your state, in your community, in the country, whether it's politics or business or the economy or the arts or the law, the Supreme Court, education, on and on, whatever your interest is, or whether it's general across the board, you just love reporting. We need you. Why? Because the American people are always going to need information they can count on. They're always going to need it. And again, whether it's reporting, maybe you want to go to Latin America or Asia to report and do international reporting, or whether you want to go to a small town in Georgia or Virginia or California and report on the school board and what the city council's doing. We need you, and we've never needed you more than we do now, especially at a time when the public has less confidence and less trust in the press. We need young people going into this profession, dedicating themselves to it, working hard, demanding answers, remembering the basics. You are the eyes and ears of the American people, and you're not there to tell people what to think. You're there to gather information and let them decide for themselves. If you later on decide you want to be an opinion writer, you want to choose sides and be an advocate, that's your decision. And Stu, I'll say this. I mean, if some people get into journalism and find out they want to instead go into the law or go into business, or they want to become a teacher, being a journalist, even for a short time, is such a great education, because you meet interesting people. You get to ask people all kinds of questions. No matter what, you get to ask them questions, as long as it's pretty respectful while you're talking to them. I mean, it's never dull. I have not had a single dull day in my life as a reporter. I don't know how many people can say that. I mean, I talk to people across the spectrum. I've interviewed everybody from secretaries to farmers to CEOs to governors to heads of state, and they all, interesting jobs. But I wouldn't trade being a reporter for anything. It's just the best job. And I think I work for of course, I'm prejudiced, but I think I work for the best news organization in the NewsHour.
Well, you transmit that excitement in your NewsHour program. So 2 last questions. One, a sort of short-term future, and then putting your thinking cap on. If and when President Trump exits, how do you think the news media will report on him? Will he get the same kind of attention as he's getting now? And that says a lot about what role he will play. He may try to delegitimize President Biden. He may try to make it more difficult for Republicans to compromise. That's become a dirty word on Capitol Hill over Biden. How will the media cover ex-President Trump?
Stu, I think the fact that he got 73 million plus votes in the election on November 3rd means that he will continue to command attention. A lot of Americans voted for him, big chunk of the country, the eligible electorate in this country. They see him as a voice for their concerns. It doesn't mean necessarily all of them are going to support him if he tries to run again. And there's some reporting that he's considering doing that. My guess is he hasn't made up his mind yet. But I think he will definitely continue to be a force in the Republican Party. And right now, as I look across the landscape of other Republicans who are in office, there are very few of them who are strong enough, willing to take him on. I mean, you can count them on the fingers of one hand in the Senate, and the same in the House, maybe even fewer in the House, even though there are 4 members. They see their fate as connected to him. If Donald Trump is with you, if he's tweeting nice things about you, if he's going to come campaign for you, they see that as a ticket to reelection. If he's criticizing you as he is right now, the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, who was a big supporter of the president, then I think you have to think about your own political future, and they are. And so we'll see what happens now that the Electoral College has voted. We'll see what happens in terms of what the president said. There's some hint that he's going to announce on Inauguration Day some of what his plans are for the future, that he'll be speaking to a large crowd somewhere. We don't know where. We don't know if that will actually happen. But I think he absolutely will be a force. What do I think the media will do? Some parts of the media will continue to give him enormous attention. It won't be as much as he had as president, but I think his Twitter feed will continue. His Twitter followers will continue to grow. He's not going away. He's not going away. And I think it's a real dilemma for those Republicans who had been thinking they were going to run for president in 2024. The Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton, and some of the others who've been eyeing 2024. How do you gracefully separate yourself from Donald Trump?
Judy, it's also a dilemma for getting the Biden agenda passed, regardless of what happens in the runoff in Georgia. If Republicans are intimidated to compromise, then the Biden agenda becomes even more complicated, and the media will have a role in how elevated they wish to put them.
Exactly right. And my hope is, and my intention is, in terms of the NewsHour, that we will cover all this as fairly as we possibly can, and give appropriate attention to all the parties involved. But I think it remains to be seen just how much of the sunlight the president's going to command, the spotlight, every day as he moves away from office.
Last question, crystal ball. The future,
I need an easy question.
the future is always hard to forecast, but look out 5 years. Where will journalism be with all the transformations we've seen? And in part, where it is will also be a reflection of where a republic will be.
I believe our democracy will always need a strong free press. So I think the press is not going anywhere. I think it will look different. I think, there people for years have forecast the end of the television network nightly news. That has not happened. I think people, this younger generation coming along, though, they will demand, news available all the time. So I think the internet will grow to be more influential. Social media will morph into new forms that we can't even imagine today. Who knows whether Twitter and Facebook and the rest of it will still be with us. My guess is they probably will be, but I just, I'm not smart enough to know. But I think I just come back to saying I fiercely believe for our democracy to stay strong, we have to have a strong press that is reporting the facts that people can count on in order to make decisions, in order to understand our country, our place in the world, in order to understand their community. So we're always going to be needed, but the way that people get that information, whether it's something implanted in your earlobe or you're wearing on your wrist, the technology I can't forecast, but I think information, we're just, as humans, we need information to function. And so the press will be here, but it's going to look different.
So in this niche, we talked about PBS. The public broadcasting service depends on congressional appropriations. it seems to me interesting that during this whole polarized era, I haven't seen a great movement on the right or the left to slash those budgets, but perhaps you see it in a different way. Will there be sufficient congressional and public support so that the kind of more objective, fact-based, in-depth news, I mean, you talked about 10-minute segments, and compare that to Twitter with a couple of hundred characters where you can really hone in on this there. Will you think congressional support sustain itself so that PBS, both the NPR, on the radio version yourself, can sustain itself and bring this kind of in-depth and more objective reporting?
Well, 2 points I would make. One is that the congressional appropriation for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is a tiny sliver of the entire federal budget. And the second point I would make as a preface is that most of that money goes to individual stations. There are over 300 television stations around the country in big cities and in medium towns and tiny towns across America, as well as the money that goes into public radio. It's divided up into all these stations that are spread around. It's that contact with the individual community that I see that is the backbone of public media in this country. I've traveled around, I've spoken at public TV and radio gatherings across America, from Seattle to Miami, and frankly, from Maine to San Diego and Texas and every place in between. And I see, when I go to visit these communities, I see people at these stations, whether it's television or radio, who are embedded in their community. They have the support of local leaders, and that gets translated, frankly, Stu, back to the political leadership in Washington. And so when Congress has to make these tough decisions about funding, they hear from these local stations who, frankly, are part of the fiber and the connective tissue in that community. And so that's what that funding goes for. And we love to joke about, you're going to get a tote bag if you give money. We do count on viewers like you to keep us going too. That is a huge part of what keeps the NewsHour going, and all of our partner programs on PBS and on public radio. And believe me, we are grateful to everybody who's able to support what we do.
And those local stations, it's a terrific point you're making of how that builds up support in Congress. Those local stations are even more important now as local newspapers close, so that there's someone at least reporting on the local news. So Judy, thank you for sharing a really fascinating set of insights on not only the role of the press, but how the press deals with this era of polarization, and how important the press is to the very foundations of our republic. And the fact that we can have this election with all its differences, we can have at least some understanding of the results, is at least some sign that the press has been able to withstand these pressures. Our courts have as well. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for honoring our family, for honoring the Ahavath Achim leadership, and for giving everyone in this very broad viewing audience a real opportunity to see a master at work, not just in reporting the news, but in giving us a sense of what's behind the news, how the press works, and its role in our democracy. Now, tomorrow night, the roles will be reversed. You'll now be asking other people questions, and we'll look forward to tuning you in and seeing you do so in the incisive way that you have. And I hope you've enjoyed being on the other end of the spectrum of getting the questions, because you've answered them brilliantly.
Well, I've enjoyed it because I've been with you, Stu. It's just a deep honor for me to be part of your memorial program and the Ahavath Achim family. It's an honor to be with all of you. And Stu, I just finally want to pay tribute to you and your extraordinary career in public service, the many, many ways over the years you've served this country. so selflessly and made a difference. Your leadership is an inspiration to all of us. So I'm just doubly honored tonight to be with you. Thank you. And it's wonderful to be with you. And you're absolutely right. I'd much rather be asking questions than answering them.
And we're even leaving on time, just as you have to on PBS. So thank you again from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.